I'm Mark Gagan and you're listening to the Voice of Insurance podcast, produced in association with Advantage Go. Pick and choose your own best-of-breed insurtech and data providers with Advantage Go's ecosystem. With a career spanning more than 30 years, today's guest is a senior executive who has the London insurance market well and truly in his blood. John Fowle has changed employer since his last appearance on this podcast, just under 3 years ago. And with a year under his belt as CEO of Atrium Underwriters, now seemed the perfect time to have him back on the show. Atrium is a Lloyd's blue-chip performer, respected in the market for its agility and underwriting skill across the cycle, and ability to punch well above its weight. As Lloyd's and Atrium are experiencing some of the best market conditions and underwriting results in their histories, this was a meeting with an executive at a business with great prospects in a market that is openly supportive to growth and innovation. With the world effectively Atrium's oyster, there are many doors and options currently open to this carrier. With so many potential choices available, the conversation that follows reveals a lot about John and Atrium's singular view of the insurance world, a view that has stood them in good stead over the last 30 years. We talk about the prospects for pricing and continued business flow into the London market, a newfound maturity over collaboration, smart distribution and innovation, and get specific updates on some of the classes in which Atrium is recognised as a leader. John is a straight-talking guest who doesn't duck any of my more sensitive questions. But for me, it's his deep understanding of how the market fits together and what it does best, coupled with the senior manager's knowledge of how to get the best out of high-performing underwriters, that really shines through this episode. Listen on, and I think you'll see what I mean. Enjoy the podcast. John, welcome back to the Voice of Insurance.
Thank you, Mark. Lovely to be with you again.
It's really, really good to see you. And it's probably been a couple of years since we last spoke, but you've been in this new role for about a year now, haven't you?
Almost exactly a year, yeah.
So, you've surveyed the landscape of your new role. Have you got any strategic priorities and things that you want to be getting on with now that you've got the lay of the land?
Yeah, I mean, I knew Atrium by reputation and as a peer and competitor, as we tend to in the London market. And everything I found here was aligned to what I expected, which really centres around very, very high quality delivery of underwriting and claims. So that's great and that's lovely. In terms of strategy going forward, what we've really been working on is getting organised around what is it that makes Atrium distinct, what makes Atrium a bit special, what has allowed Atrium to create such a strong track record of results, and then how do we build on that? How do we do more of what we're good at? I'm a great personal proponent of focusing more on doing more of what you're good at than trying to do lots of other things, so that delivering proper specialty insurance underwriting to the brokers and the clients, our strategies are all about doing more of that consistently and better over time.
Does that mean expansion, more lines, more geographies, that kind of thing?
I mean, geographies, no, not really. I mean, if you think of geographies in terms of where you have offices, for us, it's pretty simple. We're very much a London organisation with one service office in the US, which services the business that's underwritten in London. And then, again, maybe like a lot of London market specialty shops, our portfolio is global anyway. But that London market ecosystem works phenomenally well for specialty lines underwriters. It just does, because London has got that magnet for specialty business. Lloyd's always has had that. And we find that that infrastructure works really well for us. It works well for us in terms of being a place that the brokers want to bring business and do business. And then obviously the actual Lloyd's mechanism that allows your capital providers to engage in a certain way. And in our case, a very consistent group of capital providers over many decades. That all works well as well. So I haven't been tempted to start trying to convince my Atrium colleagues that we should be globally expanding or anything like that. That doesn't seem to make sense for this business.
Say doing more of what you're doing and what you're good at, but it might mean adjacent lines, that kind of thing. I often get the impression, sometimes looking outside at Atrium, that it's a sort of business where you go people first, and then once you've found a person that you think would be very good, that you already know by reputation to be very good in the marketplace in terms of an underwriter, it seems to be that you go with the underwriter first rather than anything else.
I think that's absolutely on a theme that Atrium's got this long history of being a home for very fine underwriters. Where it has been disciplined, I think, is in saying, yes, but that only really works in specialty lines. It hasn't got too carried away. And it's sought out particular types of underwriters and underwriting teams, and then just done the classic thing of saying, so what else needs to be true for you to be market beating, a top quartile performer in those areas? And again, that's not a difficult model, is it? You've got to match it up with really good support services, excellent claims adjustment, because you're typically putting yourself out there as a lead, because that's the differentiator. That's the reason the brokers come to you, is because you're problem solving. That means you need to be able to back it up with fantastic claims adjustment. And then you need to be really easy to deal with on compliance. You need to not be getting your brokers stuck in mud because stuff gets lost in your compliance department for months. And Atrium's always been very good at that. And that's, as I say, as a peer, that's what I saw demonstrated. And I'm old enough for that to be quite a long memory. But to your first part of that question, I think where we feel we can take that understanding of what good looks like and go into new areas where we think there's a real need, where we think we can bring in or develop real knowledge and expertise that, frankly, our customers, the brokers, actually care that we're delivering it. So we're not just rushing into a very busy party where there's already too many people. I think that's a real opportunity for us, because that's, if you like, that's just leveraging a core capability, as they say, which is the ability to manage specialty underwriters.
So probably in the middle of budgeting season right now, or it's certainly in this part of London, it's always budgeting season one way or another. Anyway, when you're looking out over that, where are you most encouraged at the moment? Where are you seeing the most opportunities?
I think that's an interesting question. I think we're now at that stage in the market. So we've had a few years where sort of everything's been going in the right direction on rate. And then it's really just been about different underwriting or different syndicates' appetite to be very aggressive or less aggressive, or do a bit of good housekeeping, mending the roof while the sun's shining, all these different things. I think we're now at an interesting point where rate has stabilized, in a few cases dropped off, but that really allows you to focus on longer term aspirations of classes where you think you have a sustainability in those classes. It also allows you to think about ways of approaching underwriting. Now, for us, where we do know what we're doing, there's an ability to be a bit bolder, particularly looking at the lead follow concepts and where that really works for us, where we really are a valuable leader, and how to make that work for us and make that work for the broker in a more efficient way. And then the last point on that really is looking forward and thinking about innovating and the new, which is where can we think our way through issues and gaps and insurance product and use the IP that sits in Atrium to develop really new ideas. I mean, Atrium's been quietly really good at that. It's always innovated within its lines of business, but it's also been very involved in some genuine innovative products, but in a rather classically Atrium way, in a quite understated way. And I think I'd like to get a little bit more public about our willingness and our capability to do that, and also put a bit more resource to it so we can effectively industrialize that a little bit more, rather than it being stuff that our team are just trying to do while they're trying to do everything else, try and find a way to make that a kind of distinct offering.
Are you ready to unlock the full potential of data, AI, and automation in your business? Attend the Data Jam on November 28th in London, where insurance leaders and experts come together to explore how data can drive digital transformation.
From transforming your customer experience, streamlining operations, and staying ahead of the competition with cutting-edge technologies, you'll find the latest insights at the Data Jam. Dive deep into the power of AI, learn the latest in data management, and discover how emerging technologies are reshaping the industry, all under one roof.
The Data Jam is not just about the tech. You'll get real-world insights and case studies in underwriting, claims, and operations. Plus, you'll discover how to leverage data to drive innovation in your organization.
Make data work for you. Search Data Jam today and join the insurance leaders transforming their business and operating models. Use the code VOICE for a 20% discount. That's Data Jam, November 28th in London. See you there.
Yeah, when you talk about leveraging lead follow, is it things like, if you're a leader, then perhaps opening yourself up to leading a consortium, something where you can give yourself more clout in the marketplace, so give that broker a better solution straight away, and line up some of that follow capacity almost behind yourselves?
There's definitely a two-way street there, isn't there? And I think more and more people in the market, in our classic subscription market, are getting their head around this, that there is very little to be gained in just joining the herd and setting yourself up as a leader when, frankly, you're really not. And to your point, the brokers aren't really going to give you the credibility there.
The broker's going to tell you whether you're a leader or not.
Yeah, and they have a job to do. So, if people set themselves up as leader and then maybe don't understand everything that they need to in order to be a genuinely good and sustainable leader, then the brokers will need to use that capacity. But what the brokers are actually typically far more interested in is delivering good solutions to their clients in a really efficient way. And that's, to your point, that's where consortium, where other forms of lead follow mechanism work extremely well, because they want to get the business priced properly. They want the coverage to be bespoke appropriately for their clients' needs. They want to make sure that they are doing that appropriately. So they definitely need to be able to speak to a number of leaders. But once that bit's done, they really just want the most efficient way to fill out the placement. So working out where you fit in that, class by class, I think is important. Now, that's a number of classes where Atrium would definitively be one of those leaders, and we should be maximizing that, frankly. But there are also ones that we've done a lot of work over the last 12 months at being sensible to say, well, where there are classes where that's not us, who is that underwriter and how do we support them? And we like that model because we think by applying a different underwriting skill set that is far more due diligence around who is good at this, you can complement your core classes with some profitable business following other people. And I just think that trend that's been developing for a while in the market, I think and hope that that will continue because it's a bit of a win-win. It's a win for the brokers because it's more efficient, and it's actually a definite win for the participants in the market, the underwriters. And back to the point, it's good for the brokers. So why wouldn't we all try and just get that organized well?
That's interesting to hear because I talk to some people who say, well, no, we're just a leader. We like to lead everything we do. But it's interesting to say that there's also legitimate skill in being a good follower and being effectively almost like a fund manager on that sense of being a good stock picker and saying, well, which of the horses should I be backing within this race, especially if I can't beat them? Why shouldn't I join them and benefit from their experience and also learn a huge amount about that class of business as well? And hopefully while I'm making plenty of profit.
Yes, some version of that works well, doesn't it? In other sectors, people talk about alpha versus beta, etc. But it gets quite specific in our world. I mean, it's always been true that even within, let's say, what one might consider a class, specific business lends itself to specific leaders. And then even the other leaders in the market would acknowledge that those other syndicates, those 3 or 4 syndicates are really good at that stuff. So they're happier to follow. It doesn't mean they don't have to do some underwriting, but they would happily follow those leaders. More pure lead and follow version is where you actually say, I'm not going to try and do that. I'm just going to try and back the right people. And I think if the market does that, we will all be a little bit better off. And it also might maintain this discipline where you won't get so many people doing crazy things that will drag the result down and damage the potential sustainability of the market as a whole.
It was interesting what you're saying about once the broker's got the back of the thing broken, they really don't want to expend any old-fashioned shoe leather and any other expense on getting the thing finished. For example, I had Insurex on the program in a recent podcast. I found it really interesting because often with a platform like that, the thing that would make it not work has been that the broker won't use it and therefore will effectively kill it by not using it. What was most interesting about Insurex was that it was broker-driven this time, which is a very bullish thing to see that it's the broker is recognizing that there is an efficiency to be gained here by getting something done quickly and not having to broke sort of 20 times something that you can broke for just 2 or 3 prime markets.
Yeah, and we're very closely aligned with Insurex, particularly on the market property business, because that's a role we play in that we're going to do what we're going to do anyway, i.e. we're going to see as much business as possible. We're going to try and put terms on the business that we think we can write, and we've got a very good reputation on that side. But actually, other people being able to automatically support that works really well for the broker, and it doesn't do us any harm because, effective to your point earlier, the sort of effect it has for the broker is they know that if Atrium, quote, X and it's bindable. If it gets a firm order, then they automatically have additional capacity. So it sort of puts an additional weight to our quoted terms. And I just think it's an idiosyncrasy of the subscription market, isn't it? That we do a lot of business on this basis of, well, I like this and I think I know the right price and this is the layer, but I still only want to write 15% of it. So a mechanism that turns that 15 into 50 is fantastic for the broker.
And how's that experience been so far in terms of any of that automatic follow type of underwriting?
I mean, really positive, very positive on the InsurX side. I think for all parties, it had a nice effect on our business flow. Definitely had a good result for our brokers because, as I say, they were able to deliver more capacity more quickly to their retail broker or their client. So, yeah, very positive. And I think to your point, that's one of the models where we think that does work quite well. And we think there might be some other potential ways of using that mechanism. As you know, there are a huge variety of smart follow, fast follow, etc. models out there. Again, I'm hoping that over the next couple of years, each underwriter can distill their thoughts on what works for them. We're quite clear on what works for us, but everyone needs to pick their own versions of the model and then apply them consistently.
In terms of those opportunities, are there any classes or territories from which business is emanating that you're particularly happy with at the moment? Or you don't want to tell all your trade secrets?
Yeah, no, I don't think I'd try and be, I'm not close enough to the front line to say I particularly think this territory is doing this and another territory is doing that. Of course, classically, like a lot of Lloyd's businesses, you can pretty simply say, well, you've got the North American business versus the international business. And I think, as I said at the beginning, we're at a good stage in the market where pretty much everything we do, we think is rate adequate, which is a lovely situation to be in. It's just about the supply and demand now and what happens next. But seeing the continued momentum on the surplus lines business in the US is a very positive factor because we need the rate to stay above inflation. We're wrestling with all sorts of issues around secondary perils on property, claims inflation on casualty, and that feels like quite a stable, healthy market with a continued demand with the shift from the admitted to the surplus lines market, with Lloyd's position being so good in that. So I'd say that was particularly healthy. And then I'd say everything else is a hugely mixed bag, which is to say I wouldn't want to sort of say this territory versus this.
And in terms of that flow, do you think that's peaking? Obviously, yes, flow from US admitted lines into E&S and by association also overflowing into the London market. Has that flow peaked, do you think?
I think overall, yes, we think it's probably about peaked. And that's really about local markets, increasing appetite, stepping back in, which is just that classic lagged effect of performance. The London market's had a few good years. Everyone looks at the business that they've lost to the London market and thinks, well, hang on a second, maybe we shouldn't be losing so much of that. So they then maybe loosen up their own appetite and do a bit more of it. And then just generally the global supply demand thing. And I don't mean major inflows of capital. It's just a bit closer to the front line of just underwriters looking to do more, certain businesses looking at the way their top line has gone, seeing that the rates are flattening and seeking to prop their top line up by volume, whereas pretty much everyone's been able to get their top line where they want it to be through rate. But it's at the margin at the moment, and I think it's the really interesting bit is the what happens next. Do we go into a proper ill-disciplined cycle? Are we going into a super cycle? All these factors that I think you can get very macro about. I think the bit that continues to work and the bit that I think we've all seen, you and I have seen over the decades, is that's all really important stuff, but it's all about maintaining discipline. And if you maintain discipline, then the macro comes and goes, but the bottom line stays where it needs to be.
You've got to underwrite what's in front of you and make sure you decline the things you should still be declining and making sure that...
Yeah, control what you can control, right? But don't think you can control the macro all the time.
We'll see what happens after Hurricane Milton. Again, if that just is a loss that's hopefully not too big, but also perhaps not too small. Is there such a thing as a Goldilocks-sized loss? All losses are terrible anyway, so particularly at that sort of level, maybe it'd be the right sort of size one, the one that would keep the discipline at the same time and keep the flow.
Well, and let's see what happens next,
but
right?
Still keep your profitability.
We all know that cat is the single biggest driver of our market because obviously it creates the biggest impact. And you've had Helene and now Milton. We'll see how the numbers play out for Milton. And then we've still got several weeks to go in cat season. So very interesting to see how that element affects things.
Now, zooming out to a bigger picture in terms of the flow of business and the way that business is distributed, it's been interesting. We've had this partly cyclical, partly secular change of business flow into the excess and surplus lines market, into specialty markets, away from standard vanilla markets generally, particularly in the US. But also we've seen the way that that business is underwritten. It's been transformed. In parallel with that change, we've had growth in hybrid carriers and growth in those hybrid carriers that are supporting MGAs. And that peak in MGAs, there was a pause. Certainly when the market turned, a lot of people would have said, yeah, we won't be seeing quite so many MGAs. A lot of them will be non-renewing their paper, and we're bringing all that back in-house. And that certainly happened for a while, but it was almost like that was just a pause, and suddenly the growth exploded onwards. And we're at a position where we've got many, many more MGAs than we had before, supported by hybrid carriers, but also supported by the market in general. How far do you think this could go? And is this a permanent change in the way that insurance is being underwritten and distributed?
I think there is an element of permanence about it, but I think it's because there's a greater recognition that there are different ways to play in the value chain. And I think when we come to underwriting, so underwriting at an MGA or underwriting at an MGU, and that sort of interesting bit of terminology between the two, and what are they doing? And what value are they potentially bringing to their customers? It's exactly the same way as a Lloyd's managing agent would be seeking to do, versus who is their capital and what value are they bringing to them. I think there will always be, permanently now, good MGAs and bad MGAs. Bad MGAs will not do a good job by their capital and will not ultimately do a good job by their customer. But then that's always been true of carriers as well, right? Carriers that make a whole series of mistakes, start pulling out of businesses, leaving their clients sort of effectively orphaned. That's not good either. It's all about quality businesses doing a quality job and maintaining a relationship. This whole point about one way or the other, somewhere in the value chain, you're bringing capital to risk. It's just working out what your role in that is and making sure you do it really well. I just don't think there is a universal answer that's definitely right. So if you are just thinking about it from the perspective of underwriting, if you are a good underwriter working at a big balance sheet business and you're adding value, great. If you're a really good MGA, great. But just be good at it, please, because the alternative just makes this market more volatile than it needs to in terms of its results. Will always be volatile in terms of the loss experience, and drags us down into these long periods of underperformance where it's pretty miserable for everyone.
One of my pet theories bubbling away in my head is that as you digitize the market, it makes it easier for these things to happen. Back in the old days, so 30 years ago, every time you add another link in the chain, you add 10 points to the cost. And so things get more and more complicated because lots more bits of paper are going around the marketplace. Whereas now, if you make things more seamless, more digital, then I suppose it frees people up to do the thing they're good at. I'm a good underwriter and I can leave all the other bits to somebody else. I'll leave capital provision to someone else because it's not my forte, and and they can maintain a rating with S&P and AM Best, etc. All these other things that they have to do and keep their investors happy, whereas I just have to keep them happy and keep my brokers happy, keep my clients happy, and then I'm happy because I'm adding value at the bit that I'm really good at, and I can be valued on that as well. Of course, I can have equity in that as well if I'm lucky.
Yeah, I think just working out from the retail end of distribution, as you say, all the way to capital, anything you can do that means the data flow on that is consistent and quicker. And as you say, people can then be looking at their part of that and doing it efficiently. That's got to be good news, right? And it's that bit that we've all been wrestling with of if you can cut out the frictional expense in that, obviously that's good. That's good for everyone because underwriters just want to make a sensible combined ratio, really. And doesn't actually matter if you take 2 points off your combined ratio through the loss cost or the expense. You just got to get to that sustainable combined ratio. So all power to that. And Atrium's done some very good work on that over time and has some good products that try and do that as best we can. So through our traditional distribution route, but increasingly digitizing it, making it easier for the distributor, making it easier for us, and trapping that data in a way that allows us to report on it as well, much cleaner way.
You're part of the Lloyd's market and had a slightly lighter structure than in the post-reconstruction renewal, had a more traditional capital base here at Atrium. Lloyd's obviously has always pioneered that separation of powers between the capital provision and the underwriting. And of course, you want to align the interest between the two of those. But this has been happening for 300 years here. We've seen a bifurcation, a balance sheet company split itself up into its underwriting and its balance sheet components. Do you think there's any lessons to be learned from that? Or do you think other companies might do it? In Atrium, it's almost like you're already there in many ways.
Well, I think that hybrid model, as you say, I mean, that is where Atrium's always been. And that's because it has managed to be very consistent about its underwriting performance. That's then meant that it's had a consistent capital provision through a very traditional Lloyd's model. As you say, it's effectively that survived R&R and has carried on ever since. And I think that works well. I think that allows the equity capital in the world, the equity investors and the underwriting capital providers to be, as you say, very aligned, but just looking at the business from a different angle. And that works because whatever line of business you're in, you need to be doing it in a way where investors want to put their money behind you, whether they're equity investors or whether they're capital investors. So you're right. That sort of hybrid model works. To your point, whether more people will bifurcate, truly bifurcate, I think that's a fascinating question. And it's been very interesting to watch that bifurcation play out. For a Lloyd's business, as you said, because there's something inherent in the Lloyd's model that allows a hybrid version, I'm not quite sure you have to go all the way through that. You can just do the sum of the parts work and say, well, this part of the business is about underwriting and this bit is about delivering return on capital. And they're joined like this. And smart investors can look at that and say, oh, I get it. And I get the balance between one and the other. So lots of lessons to be learned, very interesting case studies. And then how do those case studies play against what you're doing and how you're genuinely delivering to those investors, be they, as I say, pure underwriting capital investors or equity investors?
It's a pretty good time to talk about. Yes, I remember the last time we'd do a sort of back of a cigarette packet valuation of Atrium was because, of course, Atrium has changed hands a few times. That sort of thing, as a journalist, you'd say, well, what would it go for? What would the price be? What would be a good price and what would be a bad price? The sort of things that you do as a financial journalist. You look at, first of all, what's happening. And then there's always the other question in any financial journalist's mind is how much and what would it go for? Is it a good multiple? And of course, with you have that element of the fee earning side of your business and then the return earning side of the business that it was not to say totally unique, but odd ones where we would have to have two columns and add them up. It's not very complicated. Does that change in the marketplace point to a place where you might have a permanent owner? Funnily, it is, of course, the great paradox of something that this is probably one of the most stable businesses, but also happens to have changed hands 3 times.
Well, thank you. That's a great observation because that's the point, isn't it? The consistency in Atrium is Atrium. The fact that the ownership has changed and actually morphed over the last decade more than really changed, I think is interesting. The most consistent bit is that underwriting capital. That has been super, super consistent for Atrium. And obviously I've thought about this a lot over the last couple of decades, working in different environments with different types of owners. You know, being private equity owned, you know, there's some real positives to that, right? Because what you've got there is you've got a shareholder who is obviously financially extremely savvy, extremely focused on strategy and performance. So that's not a bad influence on a business where your people are generally looking at their customers and saying, what do I need to do today to do a good job as an underwriter or a claims adjuster or whatever. And then when you bring that all together, you've got this discipline of a shareholder saying, and how does this all add up? And where's it going?
And can you do it faster usually?
Well, yeah, I mean, I don't think that's a PE thing particularly, actually. That should always be the question.
Yeah, it's like, can you get on with it, please?
Yeah. Why wouldn't you? Are you doing as much of what you should be doing as you can? You know, that hasn't done Atrium any harm, and it's allowed Atrium to manage soft cycles and hard cycles because the same skill that says, are you doing as much as you could be doing now when the sun's shining is the same question set that would make you think, are you being prudent enough in the hard times? So I think the model works really well, actually, and it's worked extremely well here. And I've certainly enjoyed my first year of being in an environment like that.
Got a couple of more specific questions. One thing we'd all know Atrium for is a prominent position in the specialist end of the aviation market. You might have to send me packing because of all sorts of negotiations and court cases going on, but I wonder what you can say in terms of how the market, we've had the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I don't know if I'm allowed to say the word loss, a new bit of loss experience for us all to learn from. Did the market respond the way it should have done, do you think? It's a difficult one, and obviously I don't want to put you on the spot if it's too hard.
So I'll try and answer it in an appropriate way, but thank you for the sensitivity on it. Well, I think the situation here, because you've got an unprecedented complexity and scale of loss, what that has done is made it difficult for the market to respond in the way that I think we've previously seen the market respond so well when all risk coverage and war risk coverage are potentially both in play. It's just the scale of it is complex, and different participants in that market have their particular interests of a scale that they themselves are having to think quite individually about how they deal with it. So that's made it tough. Where we're at now, and certainly from an Atrium point of view, I think Atrium did a good job of absorbing what was going on, getting on the front foot, both in terms of the claims side and also the coverage side going forward. But we do have this effect that actually we need to see how the litigation plays out, because that's where we're going to get the key lessons, because the legal costs alone on this are immense. That would obviously suggest that the coverage wasn't ready to react in a perfectly automatic way to the loss. So we need to look at that and say, so going forward, how do we revisit the wordings in the aviation world to allow for this type of scenario? But right now we're in the learning part of that. To say, well, how is coverage ultimately going to be deemed to have responded? Trap that and move forward.
I suppose, yes, the history of insurance is having to respond to an unanticipated series of events that have led to a situation that wasn't necessarily contemplated in a wording, I suppose.
Those are always the big learnings, aren't they? You try and think of everything, and you can get into the whole, known unknowns, and then your unknown unknowns, or whatever they are, but you try and set that up. But every now and then, in most classes of business, you have something that challenges all of those preconceptions and the way the coverage was written. And you have to say, so what's the lesson? And at that point, especially in a technical, skilled class like aviation war, you then have to do the download of what is the lesson learned and what is the coverage we need to give our sophisticated insureds so that we're actually giving them what they need. And then you have to work out, and how do we price for that going forward? Because probably our pricing assumptions will have been proven probably equally wrong.
Yes, I suppose if you don't necessarily know how something's going to respond in a scenario that you didn't necessarily contemplate, then, yeah, the idea that you could have priced for it is also fanciful.
I think that's right. So I think, unfortunately, yes, it feels very painful and difficult and time-consuming at the moment. I'm just saying, I think as we work through this, we will get to a good place. It's just right now we've still got quite a lot to get through.
There's certainly demand for this product. Yes, we're not quite sure exactly what it's going to be going forward, but at least it has a future if you want to write it.
Absolutely. And, aviation's a core class to us. So, we will want to solve this problem and carry on as we have done, frankly, ever since the claims first arose. You
had a decision to exit property treaty reinsurance. Was that an Atrium-specific thing or a class-specific thing? Or is it... So obviously, we read a lot, particularly about London perhaps not being the mecca for reinsurance. It was, etc. All sorts of theories. But anyway, what was behind it from your perspective?
Yeah, it's an interesting comparison, because in aviation, that is something that Atrium lives and breathes and packs a punch in that world where we matter, because we are lead underwriters. We do a good job underwriting, and therefore the aviation market want to deal with us. I think where we'd got ourselves in property reinsurance is we'd made it incredibly difficult for the team to have any real impact. Property reinsurance is dominated by cat, obviously, but property reinsurance is a market where you've really got to have the capacity, and I suppose that's the willingness to deploy the capacity as well, in quite big numbers in order to be a relevant player. And I use that terrible analogy that I think Atrium had ended up sort of sending its team into a knife fight armed only with a toothpick. And that's tough. And despite the acumen and skill and diligence of the team, I think the job is just very tough to do. So redeploying those skilled people and indeed our appetite into areas of the business where we have a more meaningful presence for the brokers just seemed like an appropriate thing for us to do.
That makes a ton of sense. Unless you're suddenly going to go and raise a ton of capital or marshal some huge facility or something, it's not going to happen.
Yeah, and tough when the market goes through that cycle where you get pressure on signings and the smaller line people suffer because the bigger line people start to bang the table and demand that their signings are protected. To the point about Lloyd's works perfectly well for reinsurance. I think, for the big reinsurance lines, it probably just hasn't been the most efficient place to write reinsurance if you have a choice. So if you're the syndicate entity in a large corporate balance sheet business, the likelihood is that business would say, well, actually, reinsurance probably sits better in our European head office or in Bermuda. So it was losing out for that reason. I mean, fundamentally, it works okay for reinsurance. And I think particularly with Lloyd's, I think looking at it themselves and thinking about what areas of reinsurance Lloyd's underwriters might be supported in focusing, I think there might be a little bit of a renaissance. I'm not sure Lloyd's will ever be the home of the $200 million cat line being picked up by, about 4 or 5 different underwriters. That'll probably continue to remain in the larger company market centres.
I've always known Atrium's being pretty good on tech, and you've mentioned quite a lot of the sort of fruits of that, those sort of labours that you've had over generations. We couldn't be talking in 2024 without talking a bit about AI. What sort of applications have you been able to find that have been the best fit for Atrium?
Atrium's been sort of diligently trying to work out how to deploy AI for a while now, 5 or 6 years. And actually, we partnered up with one of the Lloyd's Lab participants many years ago to explore this. And where we found it most useful is actually on the claims side and looking at how natural language understanding and programming can look at where our policies are relatively standard. So this is more volume business, particularly our delegated authority business. Looking at where that policy language and indeed the exclusionary endorsements or the inclusionary endorsements, how that works, and then being able to compare that with unstructured claims documents when a claim comes in and do an early match to say, well, this is probably the nature of the loss and this is the likelihood that it's covered. So it just speeds up the claims handling process. That's been super, super efficient. And of course, it works at its best where the distribution side, the underwriting side of that is also digitized, because obviously you've got things talking to each other in a far more efficient manner. That's been a good area, and we want to build out on that because, again, it's it's an efficiency saving, it's a time saving, it cuts down error rates, et cetera, et cetera. I think that's the right way to look at AI, is not to think it's the answer to everything, but try and spot these little opportunities where it just adds a bit of value.
Someone said, well, why not get it to read 105 inspection reports, or engineering reports and find interesting things in them? Maybe it'll read number 72 that even perhaps the most diligent underwriter hadn't got to yet or might never get to. They might read the top 10 locations.
Yeah, that's the point, isn't it? You can use it to consume a lot of information quickly. That's the point. So I think we'll keep looking at that. We're definitely, like a lot of other people, trying to work out how to use it well in underwriting triage, which is maybe a similar point to the engineering point that says, look, we get this information through a submission. Well, some of this stuff we just need to get in a particular shape so the underwriter can spend 2 minutes looking at that element rather than 20 minutes looking at that element. So yeah, powerful tool, but I don't think in specialty AI is a panacea, right? It's just these marginal gains you can get from it.
It's like having a really handy assistant. So I've read all this stuff. Look at these things. This looks quite interesting. You should have a look at that. And triaging is interesting again. It's about efficiency. If it knew your appetite, it could perhaps rank what it thinks of the top 20 submissions you've got this morning as an underwriter and said, well, I think you should look at these 3 first because they're bang on. We know if you get the quote out quickly, you're probably going to get a firm order. And we know that's banging your appetite. It's in your sweet spot. So you should do these ones quickly, and then the others are getting more and more marginal as they go down the list. So, spend less time on those and hit these ones right now.
Yeah, and the automation and AI both play into this, but where you've got effectively manual administrative tasks that people have to actually look at, and then you can automate and say, well, that they actually need to be looking at them, and then you can use AI to then enhance that. There's a good road to travel down on this where we just get quicker and more efficient, and we'll grab every opportunity we can see for that.
It would be nice to be able to grow the market without necessarily having to grow the headcount and grow your profits. grow your margins without having to correspondingly grow headcount in the same proportion.
Yeah, the way I was thinking that you want your human intelligence directed at the bits where it adds the most value, right? So if you can aid and assist it by having your artificial intelligence doing the stuff where you don't actually need a human brain to do it, that's great, because it's not just good for the business, it's good for the individual. The individual gets to do the interesting stuff more because the AI assistant, as you put it earlier, is doing the boring stuff, bluntly. That's great, right? But it's easy said and harder to actually make it happen all over the place. You got to pick your spot, do that fix, see that it works, and then go, well, where can we go next with this?
Yes, and every time you automate something, if you do it wrong, if somebody becomes quite clear that it's wrong, and you get sort of Sorcerer's Apprentice type situation where the things have gone off and gone a bit wild, and before you know it, might have come off the rails.
It's like innovation, isn't it? Do that in a controlled environment. Build your pilot, test it, check it. But yeah, you don't want to be deploying things into the real world that affects your customers before you're sure that's going to be a positive impact, not a negative impact. I think the regulators might get a bit annoyed with us if we did that wrong.
In terms of your quasi-regulator here in Lloyd's, we've got the innovation class, which is not new, but now expanded, it's very significantly expanded, and the new transition class that amounts to now 10% of stamp, doesn't it? Is that an allocation you think you might be actually using the full amount of?
I love the ICX, TCX framework. I really do. I think it's sent a very strong message. I think what we found at Atrium is that there's an awful lot of innovation that goes on in pre-existing classifications. And bluntly, what we do here needs to fit the quality standards that we demand of the business. So we don't find we need the latitude. I like the latitude that ICX and TCX give you, but we don't necessarily need that in order to do what we want to do very often. So I don't think we'll be butting up against the overall 10% limit. But what I do like, again, looking forward, and mentioned when I say I want us to get more on the front foot and more out there and more industrialized about innovation, knowing that as we do that, if we find things that don't necessarily fit within our current boxes, saying, well, there we are. Now we can use ICX or we can use TCX in an efficient manner.
A situation where there's something that's a bit of a hybrid between two classes and neither of those class underwriters really want it to be on their watch or sort of affecting their potential bonus pool, for example. Then you can say, well, we'll put it over there in ICX and then it won't affect anybody.
Well, and so we've organised the business so we actually have an area of our business that is responsible for where we follow other people. It leads the way on innovation. It's just actually technically from a risk classification code, to your point, does that go into ICX or does that go back into one of our classic risk classification codes that we already have? My overriding point on that is the flexibility and the potential to use it are fantastic. I just don't think I'm going to beat myself up on did we use it or not.
And I suppose if your processes already include a certain element within a more traditional class, that you allow innovation within that traditional class, because if that's the way you've already budgeted for it, well, you won't need necessarily a new classification, will you?
That's right, exactly.
Another thing from Lloyd's, we've had news of potential new conduct framework out for consultation. What would you like to see in that from an Atrium perspective?
Well, we hugely welcome the consultation. I think everyone in this market wants there to be a robust framework to govern misconduct, and we'll be contributing into that consultation in a pretty full-blooded way because we feel we have some highly informed perspective on it. The two key bits, I think, if I was boiling down my personal message on it from an Atrium perspective into the consultation, is let's really make sure we do learn all the lessons of how conduct's been handled in the market to date. The whistleblowers and the witnesses in any of these conduct situations really need to be kept at the center of the process in a way that protects them. Because if we want a market environment where people feel that they can whistleblow and that not be to their detriment, that must be key, because that's the way that you're going to uncover poor conduct and then be able to deal with it.
With that, there's a bit of a clash there at the same time as wanting to protect some of those witnesses, but at the same time, that can sometimes get in the way of the transparency that's required for everyone to be able to learn the lesson if we don't know what the lesson is, because we couldn't publicise it. We used to have those Lloyd's disciplinary hearings that they were quite open. It was sort of like an open court style document, and you could read it and it was all there. And we don't seem to get that kind of disclosure anymore.
Yeah, I think as you're going through the process, the whistleblower has to be protected. How you ultimately publish the findings so that people can have access to that and learn the lessons is equally important, that you kind of have a framework that supports that.
Yeah, because it's important if you're going to make an example of some poor conduct, or it doesn't have to be necessarily being made an example of, just being dealt with in the right way. But part of the way of dealing with it, of course, is to publicise that so that we can all see that that is not acceptable conduct, and that can work extremely well across the market. You can see, I know that this is absolutely not acceptable conduct, and I can follow that example.
Yeah, I think I'll just completely agree with you on that, Mark, and probably not dive deeper.
But yes, obviously, any witnesses and parties to that situation need to be protected. But at the same time, you've got that situation also, but you do need to know what the misconduct was in order to be able to say, right, we know that can't ever happen around here, and it's very clear that that is not acceptable, particularly things that were tolerated before that are not acceptable now.
Yeah, spot on. You just got to find a way to gather that evidence and bluntly allow whistleblowers to whistleblow. I mean, that's the whole point. You know, any of us who have looked at how you create good whistleblowing environments, it is that point that you make it something that people feel they can do without regretting doing it. That's the key point. Because to your point, actually, we need to surface bad conduct, then we need to deal with bad conduct, and then we need to be able to explain to other people what bad conduct is and isn't. That this consultation needs to lead us down that route.
That's really good. And I think, yes, it's one of those things that I think is really hard to do in practice because you butt up against these different elements. So, yeah, I wouldn't envy anyone trying to draw up a new conduct framework, but it's good to hear the welcoming words. John, we've had a long conversation. You've just spoken about almost everything I think that's on my list of different things we could be talking about. Is there anything that you want to add that you think we missed out?
No, I think you've hit on some really interesting points. I am really fascinated to see how a few things evolve over the next few years. I do think specialty insurance is probably in a particularly interesting period where, having had a few years of rate increase and probably being at a nice level of sustainability, tackling some of these bigger issues around what does specialty insurance look like in the future? How do we embrace technology at an appropriate level while still maintaining the human touch? That's going to be really interesting. I think that's a very exciting environment for the Lloyd's market as a whole and for quintessentially specialty underwriters like Atrium. But no, I think we've hit on some really good topics.
Good. Well, it's a good market, and long may it continue to be.
Fingers crossed.
Well, I hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you did, don't forget to subscribe or leave a like or a review or recommendation on whatever podcast platform you used to access this program. These really help get the word out. Before we go, just a quick reminder that advertising slots are available here and in other places in the Voice of Insurance podcasts. Podcasting is the fastest growing medium and attracts a high quality audience of key decision makers. It's also an intimate medium where you, the listener, are right in the room with me and the interview subjects. Needless to say, that means it's a great way of getting your message out directly to an audience because you know you've got their full attention. It's also very cost effective. So get in touch with Mark at thevoiceofinsurance.com to find out how you could be speaking directly to the industry. The Voice of Insurance is produced in association with Advantage Go. Release your underwriters to underwrite with Advantage Go's underwriting platform. Voice of Insurance is produced by me, Mark Gagan. Music was written by Anna Gagan and produced by Carlos Gagan. Check out more podcasts and written comment pieces at www.thevoiceofinsurance.com.